Kingscreek is a horror podcast, and thus the content in this episode may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
You are now entering Kingscreek. Episode 5, Drenched.
Welcome back, everyone. Once again, I'm your host, Damien Bachman, and today's story is one for a rainy day, in a manner of speaking. This comes from a file marked Case D133, Recurring Nimbostratus Manifestation, which contains a few weather reports, local news stories, and a copy of an email from one Olivia Parrish to her employer, some kind of finance firm over in Vancouver. Allegedly, this is her description of why she missed work for a week in 2002. What's more interesting, though, is that during that time, she didn't just miss work. She went missing completely. She was sighted walking to the bus station for work on April 4th and then wasn't seen again until she stumbled into a gas station convenience store on the 12th. She refused to give any interviews about what happened to her. Much of the news coverage at the time seems to be convinced that she was kidnapped or wandered into the woods during that time, but this email paints a slightly different picture. So, let's begin. To whom it may concern, I want to take this opportunity to profusely apologize for my absence from April 4th to April 12th. I understand that this is a flagrant violation of worker absence policy, but I also want to know that there were some extenuating circumstances. I was hoping to avoid speaking about my experience, but as made abundantly clear by my superior, I will not be granted any leeway with anything but a detailed explanation of my sudden absence. I only hope that this story is kept away from the press so that I'm not labeled as mentally unwell. I do not know if I suffered some kind of breakdown. I suppose it is possible, since by definition a mental breakdown would affect my perception and cognitive abilities, but somehow I do not believe this is the case. Some important context. As you may already know, I live in Kingscreek. Kingscreek is a lumber town, and one that's pretty out of the way at that. It's not by any highways or interstate roads, so you don't get a ton of tourists driving through on their way to Seattle or Portland or anything. The bright side of this means that there's not a lot of the usual corporate spring-ups that you see in so-called drive-through towns. There are no McDonald's or Circle K gas stations or Starbucks or anything like that. It's all just local small businesses. It gives the town its own unique little flavor. The downside is that there aren't a lot of easy ways out. Most people who live here never really leave, and the most outside contact they get with the world is through truck drivers who deliver to the local grocery store. The only consistent way out is the bus, which only comes twice a day for people who work in the city. And if you miss it, well, then that's that. I'm one of the few who regularly take the bus. I have to for this job, and since it only comes in twice a day, I've perfected my routine so that I'm always up and ready at the bus stop at 6:15 a.m. sharp. The bus stop is a little out of the way, on the outskirts of town, so I get there with plenty of time for the bus to arrive at 6:30, take it to the city, work until 4, spend an hour at my favorite coffee shop, and then take the 5:30 bus back home. It's a routine I've followed for almost 8 years without interruption or deviation. And when I arrived at the station on the 4th, I saw no reason to think that that day would be any different. However, I did notice something strange. While the bus station is never exactly bustling with activity, it does only run the 2 times I use it, so there are usually at least 2 or 3 other people at the station waiting to take the shuttle out. Some are regulars who also work in the city like I do, and others are just people wanting to take a day trip, I suppose. I wouldn't know. I never really speak to any of them. but they are usually a comforting presence in a mundane sort of way. This time, though, I was completely alone. It was strange, I'll admit, but I wasn't too concerned with it. I had a rather pressing assignment at work that concerned me a lot more. It had to do with the new IT management system. I feel no need to speak about it at length. Point being, I was so preoccupied with this impending task that I barely noticed when it started to rain. I'm no stranger to rain. We're in the Pacific Northwest, after all. Rain is practically the default weather pattern. I usually wear a raincoat to the bus stop, but that week's precipitation mostly consisted of a light mist at worst, so I felt it was a safe enough risk to leave it at home. This turned out to be a miscalculation on my part, as within minutes of the first drops, the sky was pouring buckets. It was like a switch had been flipped. Before long, my simple woolen sweater was soaked, and strands of my hair dripped into my face. The bus station didn't have any kind of shelter aside from the trees, and they were over 50 feet away, so that option was out. I will admit, I was unhappy. It wasn't the end of the world, but I've never really enjoyed being out in the rain for too long. I don't like how it feels to have wet clothes weighing you down, having the cold patter against your head and face, the shiver that starts in your fingers and toes and travels up your spine. But it was 6:23, or so my watch told me, and that meant I didn't have to deal with it for very long. So, I decided to stick it out, or rough it, as my father used to say. Time passed. I kept checking my watch as the bus continued to not show up. 6:30 came and went with no sign of it. 5 minutes passed. Then 15. I stood there, shivering, as the rain kept pelting me from above. 30 minutes. I could feel the freezing droplets dripping from my hair and streaming down the back of my shirt. 45 minutes. It was an hour before I finally decided it was a lost cause and that the bus wasn't coming. I don't have a cell phone or anything of the like, so I decided to take the short walk back home so that I could call your department and alert them that I would be absent that day, or at least late, and then try to discern what was the matter with the bus line. It was a simple plan, and it kept me trekking through the rain, which somehow seemed to be pouring even harder than before. I marched down the road, making my way through the downpour. The waterproofing on my shoes was starting to fail by this point, cementing that there was no part of me safe from the damp. I was utterly miserable, sopping wet, shivering, and my skin starting to go numb from the constant downpour. But if I'd known where I was headed, I would have relished it. Walking down the road back into town was maddening. The rain wasn't just freezing, it was thick and hard to see through. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me, so I had no real way of knowing how close I was to town. I knew that I could get there within 15 minutes at a regular walking pace, so I soldiered on. My clothes were heavy with water soaking the fabric. They weighed me down, making what should have been a simple walk into an arduous journey, like climbing a mountain. I started to lose feeling in my extremities, and I was shivering more and more. Even considering this, I was taking a long time to reach the town, let alone my house. I had been walking and walking and walking for what seemed like hours, but I was still on the road just outside of town. Had I gotten closer at all? I checked my watch again, which by some miracle was still working. 8:37. I had been out in the rain for over 2 hours, and I was nowhere closer to any sign of civilization besides the plain tarmac road. Fear started setting in then. My heart pounded and my mind raced as the constant barrage of rainfall pounded against my scalp. I didn't understand what was happening. Where was I? Was I lost? Had I had some kind of mental break and was just wandering around? I pinched myself to see if I was dreaming, but it didn't work. My skin was already numb from the cold and rain. I didn't have any way of reaching anyone, any way of signaling for help. I didn't even have any food on me. I tried to run over to the forest for some kind of shelter underneath the trees, but I realized with rising terror that the rain was so thick and my vision was so blurred that I didn't know which way the forest was. I ran in one direction, then the other. I tried running in every direction, but somehow I never left the harsh asphalt. I screamed for help. I wore out my voice ragged, screaming in any direction, but it somehow never managed to cut through the overpowering sound of water pounding against concrete. My shoes were fully soaked now, and they squelched rhythmically every time I took a step, and it only got louder when I ran. Because I did run. Or at least, I tried. Every step felt like I was carrying a 20-pound weight on each foot, and the rapidly growing puddles always splashed a new wave of wet, cold, and dirt onto me if I wasn't careful. And before long, I stopped caring about being careful. All the while, I felt my senses and my energy diminishing, being beaten down by the constant, heavy pressure of what felt like millions of raindrops every second. My muscles ached and complained every time I moved, and it was getting hard to even breathe. And all that was just in the parts I could still feel. My fingers, hands, face, feet, and scalp had long since lost any sense of feeling besides the soft burn of the cold and steady drumbeat of the rain. I might have cried, but if I did, the tears were lost in the ocean of rainwater. I have no idea how long I was like that. My watch stopped working pretty early on, and the rain was so thick and the dark clouds blotted out the sky so completely that I couldn't tell day from night. It could have been hours, days, weeks, or even months, and I never would have known the difference. The thought had occurred to me on more than one occasion that I was going to die out there, shivering and cold, the life slowly drained out of me by the elements. When it got particularly bad, I thought about just lying down on the asphalt and letting the water fill my lungs. I didn't consider it for long, but it was there. I already felt like I was drowning, just painfully slowly. I was like the opposite of a frog in a boiling pot of water. Time passed. I didn't eat, barely slept, and continued to trudge slowly down the road. My body was tired from shivering, every muscle screaming every time I moved. My clothes were a soggy mess. I could feel my feet covered in blisters, and I chafed everywhere. But all of that was better than the overwhelming feeling of numbing cold. I was, at this point, at my lowest when I encountered the worst part of it all. I saw a shadow cutting through the wall of water. I couldn't quite tell if it was a person or not, but it was the first thing I'd seen other than rain and asphalt in God knows how long. A bright, hot streak of hope pushed through the fog in my mind, and I summoned the energy and adrenaline to start running towards it. I called out to the shadow, asking it for help, but as I got closer, something became very obviously wrong. It was tall, way too tall. It had to be 8 or 9 feet. It was also impossibly skinny, like a telephone pole. As I got closer, I started to see its limbs, almost like sticks, hanging at its side. It was shaped like a person and seemed to be wearing clothes like a person, but the closer I got, the more I realized it couldn't actually place any specific details. I slowed to a stop about 5 feet in front of it. The rain was still thick enough that I couldn't quite see it completely clearly, but I had come this far. I opened my mouth to speak to it, but before I could, something happened that stole my breath away. It moved. I realized it had been facing away from me this whole time. It had to have been, because when it bent down and swiveled its head towards me in one lightning quick motion, I saw its eyes, and I would not have missed them before. They were wide and staring. The bright red irises practically glowed, shining against the thing's otherwise featureless head. The pupils were 2 needle points of jet black, and they bored into me, sending brand new chills up my spine that I thought I had grown numb to. And that was when I realized with horror that the reason I couldn't make out the rest of the thing's body was because it was a part of the rainfall. I could only see it through the wall of downpour, and whenever a raindrop left an uninterrupted view, there was nothing but the gray fog behind. I won't be shy about it. I ran then. I screamed and then I ran. 2 things I didn't think I was still able to do. I ran and I ran and I ran, the thing's eyes still there, watching whenever I blinked. I ran until I saw a light, the first real light I had seen in a long time, and I ran towards it. I didn't stop running until I was safe inside the dingy old Dash Mart, dripping all over the floor. From there, you can piece together the rest of the story from the various news reports about my disappearance, which I will attach to this email. I don't know how much of this story was actually explainable by rational minds, but at the very least, I wanted to provide evidence of something strange preventing me from coming into work. Whether that's a product of my mind, a product of the rainstorm, or a product of that bus station, I don't know. What I do know is that I will be taking a carpool from now on. Sincerely, Olivia Parrish. Uncle Mark tried to follow up with Miss Parrish immediately following her disappearance, but could only get a copy of this email from her. She categorically refused to speak about her experience in any more detail, refusing any follow-up questions or clarifications. Other than that, she still seems to be doing well, and I believe I've actually seen her from time to time near the carpool pickup, a location very firmly within the town boundaries and in clear view of people's houses. Some interesting details. From the description of Miss Parrish's experience, it's a wonder she's alive in one piece, even disregarding any paranormal parts of her story. The temperature the week she disappeared had highs of, at most, 45 degrees and got down to 33 at night, so it's a wonder she didn't succumb to hypothermia. In fact, she was pretty much physically intact when they found her. The only thing she was suffering from was exhaustion and the beginnings of starvation. There also wasn't a lot of rain that week. In fact, it was the driest week of April that year. The authorities who found her assumed that she must have fallen in the lake while wandering the woods or something of that nature. And of course, there's the thing she saw in the raindrops. I'm still getting the hang of these files, but I know enough now that the mentions of it in the story are marked with one of Uncle Mark's strange numbering systems. It refers to a file he has that references a few other cases, including one about some missing hitchhikers and some waterlogged corpses. I have no doubt that if this story is real, Miss Parrish escaped something terrible by the skin of her teeth. This is Damien Bachman, signing off.
Today's episode of Kingscreek was written and performed by Thomas S. Dennis. It was produced by James Makepeace, and the score was composed by Kai After Kai. Script supervision is provided by James Makepeace and Ryan Kennedy. Our cover art is by CyberGrapeUK, and our social media manager is Ryan Kennedy. All episodes are a production of Tracer Magnum Entertainment. If you'd like to support the show, rate and review us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Chatbox, or whatever service you use to listen to our show. It helps tremendously and ensures we're seen by more and more of the unsuspecting public. If you'd like to get in touch with us or become involved with the community, join our Discord server or follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Tumblr, all under the handle @KingscreekOfficial. Share with your friends, family, or anyone else you want to ensnare in our web. And above all else, thank you for listening.